Everyone is a theologian. If you've ever asked questions about who God is or what he asks of you, what he's like, who you are with him, these are all the kinds of questions that theologians ask. So we wanted to explore the real lives and real stories of real, everyday theologians here in Houston and explore what it looks like to take your faith outside of Sunday mornings and Bible studies and into the real world. So welcome to Everyday Theology. We are here today with Giorgio Villani, but before I have you tell us all your story, just a reminder that this is Everyday Theology, which is a part of the overall organization Theology by the Pint, where we gather together in Houston for really cool events. We talk about theology and faith and culture and philosophy, and sometimes we get into some spicy culture war topics. It's a lot of fun. And we do all of that with a great sense of humor and a craft beer in our hands. So if you like beer and talking about interesting things, you should come. And you can find out everything you need to know about us at theologybythepint.org. theologybythepint.org. That's where you can also find all of the other stories like the one we're about to listen to today. But welcome to our show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, I was just saying, we just recorded another one. I don't know when these will come out, but you were very brave for coming in here because until 5 minutes ago, we never met. But a friend of a friend thought that that you would be good for the show, so I'm excited to hear your story. So tell us a little bit about you, who you are. How did you grow up? You mentioned before we started recording that you did not grow up religious at all. So tell us a little bit about how you came to faith.
Okay, well, yeah, so my background is essentially I'm a Houstonian. I was born in Houston. My father's Italian and my mother's American. She's Texan, born in Houston. And, my mom's side has been here for a couple generations. But right after I was born, I basically moved with my father, my mother, and my sister to Italy, to Milan.
Ooh.
And we stayed there for...
Fashion capital.
Yeah, exactly. And that's actually where my father's from. So we went over there and he was like working there. But then after staying there for I think it was 3 or 4 years, I was a child, very young, we went to Connecticut and we were there for a couple of years and then we came back to Houston because, my mother wanted to move back to Houston to be close to family. And so, that's basically, my full circle back to Houston. And I've been here for 20 plus years. And so, just native Houstonian, grew up here. Yeah. Had to deal with the very hot summers for years.
And you said you have an Italian dad and a Texan mom. Those are some strong personalities, maybe.
Yeah, absolutely. It's kind of a funny story too, because it's how does that even happen? My grandmother was actually an opera singer.
Ooh.
And she was also one of the founders of Opera in the Heights over in the Heights. And then she was also, I think she also sang at Houston Grand Opera. Mm-hmm. But during that time, the reason why there's an Italian connection is because my grandmother was singing in Italy and doing stuff there. And my mother was actually in a private school in Milan. Okay. They didn't actually meet in Milan. They met in New York later on, and but they connected through mutual friends. Funny. And so there's always been kind of an Italian connection there. Because of my grandmother, basically.
Okay.
Yeah.
Love that.
So, and
but it was not a religious home that you grew up in.
No, it was not a religious home. The way that it's kind of happened in my family was the women are Christians, but they, my grandmother's a Christian Scientist.
Oh wow.
But it was never pushed on anybody. Yeah. And my mother's Christian, but she doesn't go to church.
Kind of in name only, maybe.
Yeah, it's more of a cultural Christian. Yeah. And basically, my father and all the guys over in Italy are not religious. That's a Catholic side. Yeah. But then the guys just never were religious, and it was almost like they're not. I wouldn't say that they're actively against it, but they just didn't.
Not for them.
They didn't do it. Yeah. They didn't do it at all. So the vast majority of my life was basically not religious in any way. And I was also essentially an atheist for the vast majority of my life. And
now, were you an atheist you actually really thought about it and you arrived there, or you were an atheist because by default you didn't really find anything interesting about any of the organized?
The thing about and I don't know what your experience is with other atheists, but basically atheism is an active, not necessarily active, but rather you find yourself in situations where you're talking to and you feel compelled to, argue it.
Okay.
And so you say, oh, like it's all the same, kind of cliches. Oh, it's a fantasy. Oh, it's like, I don't believe in the, what do you call Santa Claus? It's just a story, whatever. Right. So it's kind of like, it's kind of an active thing, but what I found, and this is kind of the whole journey, is that basically, it just doesn't leave you with anything really. It kind of pushes you into kind of a mindset where you're struggling, especially once you get past all this, like college and things like that. You're kind of like, okay, well, what is the purpose of all this, and there's only, especially with Christianity, or at least what I found in Christianity, is that there is guidance, where you don't have guidance, like you're having to discover all these things, as an atheist, and try to figure out your own philosophy. And it's just like, there is no real compass, and it's kind of empty in a way.
Yeah. Or lonely even.
Yeah. Yeah. Lonely. And, and it also puts you in a different state of mind as well. Like, it's heavy. Like it's heavy when you, like the things that you would do if you have failures, you take it because you're owning everything. You're saying this is all my responsibility and this is all the action. So as opposed to feeling like there's a higher power, or knowing that there's a higher power that's looking after you. Yeah. And that's, and it's funny because like my progression into actually believing in Christ is also kind of like a gradual progression as well. Like I didn't actually start off with the New Testament as well. Like I started off with the Old Testament, and the Old Testament was actually.
Wait. So, but how did that even happen? So you're in atheist land. Yeah. Did someone just like challenge you, like, bro, read it, or like what?
No, not really. I think I was thinking about it the other day. I was like, what actually triggered that? And I think what happened was either I'm watching a show or I'm like listening to, and then they quote it. They either quote Proverbs or they quote like Psalms, or they're something poetic. Yeah, something poetic. But Proverbs, the thing that connected with me was Proverbs. Huh. Okay. Because it was just like I can't even remember what it was, but basically I was like, okay, let me find that verse. Okay. And let me go into the Bible and find the verse. And then I was like, oh, that's interesting. And then I started some
wisdom there.
Yeah, and upon reflection afterwards, I was like, yeah, that's really what was missing is wisdom in a way. Because like as an atheist, it's not like you're thinking through things. Yeah. But you don't have like you're doing it all off the cuff in a way. Like you're having like mentorship is also kind of like if you're lucky, you'll have a mentor. And that mentor will be able to kind of give you guidance. But if you don't have guidance,
you have to drum it all up internally rather than look externally.
Exactly. Yeah. And it's a huge burden, and it's also kind of like, in a way, it's like not even efficient because like, why aren't you talking to people who actually have had these experiences? Yeah. Our de-emphasis on older people, and especially in current society, I think is causing a lot of issues.
Agreed.
But the thing about the Bible and the Old Testament Proverbs specifically is that it's very authoritative, and it's just like, don't do this, don't do this. And then as you read into it and you kind of like try to understand it within the context of your life, then you're like, wow, that is a good point. And that is wise too.
And it lands.
Yeah. And it lands. And so I started to just consume Proverbs. Like Proverbs was like where I started. And then I was like, oh, well, then I'll read Ecclesiastes.
Man, you did not start with the light stuff.
I didn't. I mean, I had heard like the stories, Genesis and all this stuff. But then what got me back into it was that stuff, right? The wisdom section of the Bible, right? Whereas Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Ecclesiastes is also kind of like, it's very philosophical too.
It's like, kind of a downer sometimes.
It's kind of a downer, but it's it's funny because like when you read it, it sounds like it sounds like something that you've heard before, that you've heard maybe some modern person saying, and you're like, oh, that's interesting that they're saying something like that. It almost kind of like sounds not nihilistic, but like kind of, it's almost like, put things into context that this is not just
all there is.
You think that this particular point in time is a unique moment, right? And you have to put it in the context of all of human history.
Yeah.
And I think it's in a sense, it's kind of a philosophical book as well. So I started with those, and then I was like, man, this is like really good. I want to keep on reading. So it started to pull me in.
Yeah.
And but of course, in that moment, I was primarily focused on the Old Testament, because the Old Testament kind of appealed to my sense of like justice and my sense of like right and wrong.
Yes.
Right? Is that there, people who are bad, they are punished, and people who are good, then they're rewarded in a way. Like that
kind of fits the rubric that we use in our life.
So it made sense, and I was actually reluctant to start reading the New Testament as well, because and I have Christian friends, and they were like, oh, you need to. It's funny because I would be talking to them about the Old Testament. I'm like, oh, the Old Testament. I love the Old Testament. It's like so great. It's so great. And then they were like, well, you need to take a look at the New Testament. The New Testament. It's almost like they were kind of downplaying the Old Testament. And I only realized why they were doing that was because the
concept of grace.
Yeah, the new covenant, and there's like this whole thing, right? And so, but I was like, why are they so standoffish about the New Old Testament? That's what I like.
I love the Old Testament. I do.
Yeah, so I was like, that was the whole thing. But then I eventually broke down and I read the New Testament.
Broke down and read about Jesus.
I was like, okay.
I've heard he was cool.
I was like, let me take a look at this. And then of course, it's amazing. Like you're reading it and you're just like, okay, like this is, it's poetic. It's like, there's all these, so it's a beautiful piece of, writing as well. So I could appreciate it on that level, but then also.
Did you have anyone at this point, like kind of walking through and explaining the stuff that's hard to understand? Because the Bible's not exactly intuitive.
This was a
self-study.
Well, okay, let me back up a little bit, because, our mutual friend, Christine, I was talking to her, and I was doing it primarily one-on-one with another person. I wasn't going to church.
Yeah.
As a matter of fact, Christine actually brought me to a church.
Oh wow!
And it was fun. It was a kind of a funny story with that too, because I was like, I'm just like essentially an outsider. I'm not like I haven't gone to church. I don't really know how it functions. And I was like going there.
Did she bring you to the story?
Yeah, she did.
Yeah, it's a good church.
And I was like, I was kind of thinking it was going to be like a Bible study.
Oh, and then there's like hundreds of people there.
Well, yeah, and then also there's like this whole part of it where they're singing, and I was like, what is this singing about? Like, I want to.
That's so funny that you could be in America at that age and still have that be such a like foreign experience.
I didn't realize that I was so integrated in the way that this. Like, I was completely out of it. Like, I wasn't looking at religion. Funny. Yeah, so I was completely. I didn't even really even know how the churches were structured. I kind of thought that they were primarily just Bible studies.
Yeah.
And I was excited about that. I was like, okay, well, I want to start figuring out what these passages mean. And then I went to, the first thing that I did over at the church's story was that it was the one where they have near-death experiences.
Okay.
So it was like a specific thing, like that they brought a guy who had
they had like a guest speaking about it. Okay.
Yeah, and so it was interesting because I'm there. It was like a special in a way. Like it was like a special, you know. And so they were talking about these like specific things, and it was interesting. I mean, I thought it was cool, you know. Like
But for the most part, you were reading the Bible with a
independently.
Friend.
Well, independently, and then I would basically. Like, I got to the point where I was like, okay, well, I'm reading this completely out of order. I don't know if that's good or bad.
I don't think there's any wrong way to.
And then I think I even skipped Job, too. So, like, I went and I was like, oh, Job seems long. So I'm just going to go to
Seems long. It is long.
So then I was like, okay, I'm going to go to the other thing. I eventually went back, but then I started jumping around.
Yeah.
And it was kind of just, I was just kind of like letting it happen.
Yeah.
You know? Like I was just kind of like going with my intuition on that.
Yeah.
And yeah, so I was doing that, and then then I went to the New Testament, and then I was like really connecting with that as well. And there was all these all the parables that I was also like I had heard about, but I didn't know, you know, like I heard them in like because people reference them all the time, like they're constantly in conversation.
They're in common parlance a lot.
Yeah,
of them.
And that's you know I joked with Christine. I was like, yeah, it's so funny because like people kind of refer to their own morality. Like they're like, oh, you know, this is what I believe. It's just right. And you're like, yeah, that's just like Christianity.
That's borrowed.
Yeah. That's like not, you didn't come up with that. Like,
right. This is plagiarism.
Yeah. This is like something that is beyond your, like the moment in time in which you're existing. Like this is existing. And I feel like sometimes the arrogance of people to also assume that like, this is just like normal. Like this is just obvious. Like when you're thinking about the context of a lot of these, especially Christianity in the middle of, you know, the Roman Empire happening, and people are just like, those are not obvious. Like those ethics were not obvious. Like people were just, I mean, it was more normal. I mean, it was normal for people to crucify people, feed them to lions in the Colosseum. Like that was normal. Like it was like might was right at that point. And so for us to kind of just be like, oh, well, it's just treat everybody with respect. Yeah. It's like, that's not obvious, you know?
That's so interesting. You are a philosopher. I can see why Christine was drawn to you. Well, so at some point in this process, though, I mean, can you sort of pinpoint when there was sort of an aha moment where it went from being like, there's a lot of wisdom here, this feels purposeful, to like, I now would say I'm a follower of Jesus?
Yeah.
Hey, guys. Sarah Stone here. Sorry to interrupt what I'm sure is a riveting podcast episode, but Theology by the Pint needs your help to continue providing these podcasts, offering our in-person events, and growing so we can bring thoughtful conversation and the hope of the gospel to a world that's increasingly walking away from church and from faith. Now that we're a 501c3 nonprofit, all donations are tax deductible, so we've crunched the numbers, and if each listener of this episode gave just $1 for each episode you listen to, we'd put a huge dent in our annual budget. So consider giving today. Go to theologybythepint.org/give and click the link to donate. Thanks so much, and now back to our show.
Yeah, I mean, when I started reading the Gospels, like, you know,
you're like, I want in on that.
Yeah, I mean, it was the experience that basically was highlighted by other people. Other people were like, "Oh, you need to read it," and I was like, "Okay, they just like their book, you know, like that their team that they're rooting for."
Their team.
But no, when I was reading, I was connecting with it on a spiritual level. Like it was actually affecting me.
Yeah.
You know? And I was like, you know, and then also diving into it and being like, you know, just the model of like, you know, we're all deeply flawed.
Yeah.
And I see that to be the truth. And, you know, to be able to, you know, like just reconcile with that fact and then be able to continue. Like, because I think especially in this day and age, people are kind of assigning, you know, moral platitudes about certain people or whatever. And it's like, we're all kind of like equal
in our messiness
and in the eyes of God.
Yeah.
You know? And so we're all, you know, not kind of like, we're not all destined by default. You know, nobody is born, you know, with just being perfect, you know? So we all have
no one good, no, not one. That's what.
Yeah. So we have to like, you know, work through that and to be able to, you know, have grace in the eyes of God or through the new covenant.
Yeah.
Is like important. And it's like also a mental, like to be able to continue in what you're doing, like, and draw strength from it. I think that's important.
Yeah. So this is all pretty recent for you in the last few years.
Yeah, it's the last few years. Yeah.
Okay. And so then when you were finally, I guess, on Team Jesus, did that change anything for, I mean, I'm going to ask you in a second what it is, but let's just get to that now. Tell us a little bit about what you do in your work life.
Yeah. Well, okay. So for the before I started on an entrepreneurial journey.
Okay.
I was about 10 years in oil and gas.
Okay.
I think it was about a year and a half in inspections, oil and gas inspections, which is like climbing on these tanks. We have massive tanks.
Yeah.
By the ship channel. Houston has like a massive channel, and we have these refineries and terminals and things like that. So I would go into there and I would do these inspections for. The company was an inspection company. Get into the vessels, go into the cargo holds of the vessels.
That's
these
scary.
massive stainless. Yeah, those were. It was pretty scary because I mean, when you think about it, like there's all this safety stuff that you got to do. That because if you were to go into a tank, one of these tankers, there's areas that don't have air. And
my boyfriend actually works in logistics with ISO tanks, a little bit smaller, I think, but there are all these protocol about various chemicals you can and can't touch and certain cleaning things that like a drop could kill you kind of.
Oh, yeah. And I mean, the oxygen stuff is because you have to put an O2 meter into the tanks.
Gosh. Yeah.
And the way that the protocol is that, like, okay, when somebody like drops down and passes out in the tank, your natural impulse is to go down there. But you'll be and there's been instances where people they follow in and they all die. Like,
oh my gosh.
Yeah. So there's a lot of protocols to prevent that from happening, but it's a dangerous thing. But it's a surreal experience because when you're in a tank, and I've gone into a couple of these tanks, you're in this massive structure, stainless steel structure, and you're looking around and you're just like in a tomb, basically.
Oh my gosh. Ooh, that makes me feel like claustrophobic or something.
Oh yeah. I mean, that's crazy.
It's not for the faint of heart.
But yeah, it was a good job. But then after that, I went to commodity trading. So I worked for a company, commodity trading company. And I did that for 7-8 years, and it was great. Loved it. But the only thing is that like I also was in the Web3 space, which
what is that?
So Web3 is it's kind of like a dirty word to a certain extent to a lot of people. It's like crypto, Bitcoin, stuff like that.
Yeah, yeah.
But I was introduced to it by a friend in 2013, and he kind of told me about it, and I just kind of like fell in love with the concept of empowering individuals, to have self-sovereignty over their own data, over their own identity. And it's been kind of like commercialized, just like every other thing, just like AI. People are kind of using this, and the initial idea is I think more pure. But anyway, I did that, and then I essentially quit my job 2 years ago, and I've been on an entrepreneurial type movement.
Track.
Yeah. So I started a company called Spindletop Digital, which is a software development company, Web3 software development. And I also just recently opened a studio over in the East End called Forgin, which is essentially an art tech fusion studio. So like bringing artists and then also bringing technologists, robotics, AI, digital art, like people who are coding art, like generative art, all in one space, and basically presenting it, doing workshops, having residencies, gallery as well. And
that's very cool.
Yeah, there's also a nonprofit element. We just got approved to be fiscally sponsored by Fresh Arts.
Okay.
And so they are also, we're kind of doing that as well. So
you have a lot of plates going.
Yeah, yeah. Art has been recently a big element to the software development stuff because I also run a Web3 meetup, and Web3 is basically the ecosystem of what is Bitcoin to a certain extent. I don't know if we want to get too deep into that, but basically Web3 is its own thing. And so I don't know, what was the original question?
Well, I was just asking what you do. Because
so that's what I do. So I run a studio and then a software development company.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you don't really like have an office per se. I mean, do you don't just go in 9 to 5? You have different spaces you're in, and you have people you manage, I assume.
So I work from home, but I also I have the studio now. So I'm building out the studio. It's a 1,250 square foot studio space. Building it out, insulated it, installing ACs, like building it out like completely. And then that'll be kind of a place where I'll co-work and I'll bring other people in there and we'll all work together.
Yeah. Okay.
On various projects.
So
kind of like the prototype lab over at the Ion.
Okay. Yeah. So you're mixing and mingling with a lot of different types of people. I mean, you've got artists, people in the software world. I'm sure people from your sort of former life in oil and gas. How, when you became a Christian, did that change any of those kind of relationships? Do they know that about you? Is that sort of hush hush? Does that intersect with your work life at all?
I mean, I think it, I mean, I'm not like talking, I'm not like evangelizing.
You're not preaching.
Yeah, I'm not evangelizing. I'm basically, for me, it's a personal journey. I don't have all the answers. So I generally, just, as I'm exploring it, like it might come into like, for example, I had a conversation with my co-organizer for Web3 about just, kind of like modern day philosophy that just kind of devolves into some derivative of nihilism.
Yeah.
And everything is basically nihil. Like when people have their own
Say
philosophy.
For our audience, if people don't know what nihilism is, how do you understand? What does that word mean?
Well, so my understanding is just kind of like, life is meaningless. Mm-hmm. There's no, so therefore, if you can agree, or if you can, nail down the pinnacle element of the philosophy is like, okay, life is meaningless. You derive everything else, which is like, okay, well, if life is meaningless, then you have to derive your own meaning to life. Mm-hmm. And as a result, people will come up with an infinite number of ways to run their lives. Mm-hmm. Like, oh, well, I'm just going to enjoy life. I'm just going to try to maximize my enjoyment. Or
so that's where you get sort of hedonism.
Yeah, a type of hedonism, or utilitarian, which is like, okay, well, I'm going to maximize what I perceive as being the best outcome for mm-hmm. everybody. So you get all these other things that are kind of like, I would say they're kind of like a derivative of nihilism to me, because it's more like, okay, that we have to create our own. If
you're alone in this world and things are meaningless, then you're on your own to create meaning and
exactly
enjoyment and those kinds of things.
Yeah, and I kind of concluded that it's hard to have a philosophy like that, because it's just like you will at some point you will get knocked down, and mm-hmm. then you're like, oh well, the main tenet of my philosophy is life is meaningless.
Yeah.
And so I'm failing at all these other things that I'm doing, right? Like I might want to maximize good, but I'm failing at that. So I'll go back to life is meaningless, like, cause that's the main tenet for it. And so it's really easy to be like not stable in terms of your philosophy, and to be knocked down and then have a harder time getting up.
Yeah. I mean, it can be very depressing.
Yeah, absolutely. But
so you were saying you were having a conversation with a buddy about this, a coworker.
Oh no, yeah. So if I'm having a conversation with somebody, I'm like, oh yeah, and there's like an active like, we need to kind of like return to this fundamental thing that has worked for us for so long, that we take for granted.
Yeah.
That we just assume that we just came up with it ourselves. Yeah. Like there's a level of arrogance that's associated with like not giving. Like not giving
credit where it's
due, like, so yeah. And then having a little bit of humility as well, like realizing that these things were all done for a reason and they served a purpose, and mm-hmm. you didn't just all of a sudden come into the world coming, like the level of arrogance, modern arrogance, I think is important. Is one of the key reasons why a lot of these issues are happening, is that, and having the framework of, Christianity is realizing that, you need to put things into context, and then also realize that there's a greater being, God, that wants you to be successful and wants you to, has faith in your abilities. And
well, it's two entirely different worldviews. Mm-hmm. If you have the hubris of saying like, I deserve, mm-hmm. I'm naturally good and I deserve good things. But then the Christian worldview says, no, like you live to serve others and you follow God, you follow Christ, who is King of the universe. Mm-hmm. And so that changes everything. It changes how you talk to people, how you spend your money, how you spend your time, sacrifices that you make.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, yeah.
Yeah, it's also kind of like another thing that I was telling Christine was that as an atheist, you have this. It's very much like being religious in a way.
Oh yeah, it is a religion.
Yeah, it's like a type of religion, because and it's a religion that's kind of like because you basically already have like in your head what what you believe is to be reality, and then you start seeing things, and you start trying to identify things to support that, right?
To rationalize what you already believe.
Yeah, exactly. And so, I gave her the example one time. I was, and I think a lot of people have done this as well. It's like you're under stress. And I remember distinctly, like when I was younger, I was like having conversations with God, not believing in him.
Interesting. There's no atheists in foxholes. That's that kind of mentality.
Well, I think people will, I think a lot of people try to test God.
Okay.
And
like a if you're real kind of thing.
Exactly. Yeah. If you're real. And so I had that experience where it's like, and then writing it off. Like, for example, I had the situation where I was like sitting at the bus stop and I was late because I was like, I was going out to the bus stop and I was like, oh, okay, I didn't manage my time properly and I got out there late and I'm like, oh my, I have to go back and I have to tell my mom like to take me to school.
Yeah.
And so I'm like, and you make a bargain and you're like, God, if you make yourself present, and show me that this is, then I'll believe in you.
By what, making the bus come after or something? Yeah.
And I mean, it's petty, but like, I think
a lot of people do it though.
People do it all the time, right?
Yeah.
But then of course, when it happens, which in retrospect, becoming a Christian, I've actually made that bargain many times. And I think a lot of the time, if not all of the times, it happens. And so, but then I rationalize it.
Right.
And I say, oh, well, that's, just random chance, really. And
interesting.
And then so recently I was going through this and I'm like, I do this all the time and I'm just not listening. Mm-hmm. And so I think, when I became Christian, I started to reevaluate things that had already happened and then realize that at that point, like I was always being supported.
Interesting.
And so in that particular situation, like I think people should start like truly having a discussion because like I'm having a discussion with God, but I'm not listening.
Right. It's a one-way
I'm ignoring it,
sort of
right?
discussion. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's like, I mean, also recently, like you think to yourself like, okay, well that needed to happen. Like maybe that was part of the whole journey, maybe, me having that conversation, like, and then denying it was part of a greater realization.
Sure.
And so, I mean, I'm constantly thinking through these things like, and that's I think that's one of like the best parts of studying the Bible is that you start to become it starts to become an active conversation with you and God. Yeah. And and it's active on his part too. Like, it's like you're getting like it's happening back, like at least with my experience, like I'm actually, and so then it's like nothing is more, like affirming to me that it's actually happening
and it's real. And he's pursuing you.
Yeah, exactly. So
I love that.
Yeah. So then it's like, it's hard to, deny it at that point for me.
So I had asked like how it intersects with work. Would you say that most of the people that are in your orbit kind of know that this is where you are in this journey? Or do you think if I were to ask most of them, they'd be like, actually, no, I don't know. Like,
yeah, I don't.
Because you speak very philosophically, so I can imagine that that's a doorway that's kind of constantly being opened.
I mean, I'm not always talking philosophy or philosophically with everybody.
Yeah,
I'm not like, sometimes we just got to get certain things done, right? And we're not, but if we're hanging out, and we're talking about what we believe, and you get into a deep conversation, which I mean, it doesn't happen with everybody.
But you feel freedom to do that in your industry. I mean, you're an entrepreneur now, so you kind of make your own rules, right?
Well, yeah, that's why, it happened recently. When you think about it, it aligns with me being an entrepreneur. Yeah. So, when it's a lot easier to not have faith when you kind of have a like being in a corporate environment.
Someone else is setting the rules and
you're kind of like in a system that, it's bigger than you, and you're kind of like going through climbing the corporate ladder, and so then it's almost like taking for granted, the ease of, certain things in life. Yeah. I mean, not to say that my corporate situation was easy, but like it's like a track. There. It's a track, right? Yeah. And so when you go into a situation where like you have to create your own your
everything.
own everything, right? Like then it's like, okay, then you get tested, you know? And that, I think it was a calling for me to go down an entrepreneurial route. And I think also it has to do with like a calling to going through trials and tribulations, you know? It's not necessarily easy, you know, to start something from scratch.
Nope.
And also it's also an industry that people don't know very much about, like Web3. That's a very niche thing that it's not pervasive. People don't know about it. So you have to have a little bit more of a support structure internally to be able to roll with the punches.
Yeah.
And so that's where I think faith becomes, you know, it becomes, not, I don't want to say stronger, but like it becomes more clear why we need it, you know? When everything's good, and I feel like that might be one of the reasons why, you know, in the United States, faith is, I feel like faith and, you know, the situation around us degrading is connected. Like,
oh, 100%.
So losing faith. Because if you believe, because it's a good time, it's like good times create kind of like this idea that you are, you know, the master of your own future.
Yeah, you're self-sufficient. Right? You don't have a need.
I don't need anything. I don't. Oh, that's the opium of the masses, right? That's for weak people.
Yeah.
But in reality, I think it's really the opposite. I think that you know, when you believing in, because you know, opium of the masses implies that it's like a temporary fix. So believing in your own glory and believing in your own might make you feel good for that moment, but it's not like a long burn.
Yeah.
It's gonna, eventually you're gonna stumble and you're gonna be like, I was completely wrong.
Yeah.
And it's hard to have faith in yourself all the time. But
yeah, there's a book that says I don't have enough faith to be an atheist, because it does take more faith to live that way, just constantly like drumming up your own everything, rather than relying on, you know, the creator of the whole universe that sustains everything.
Yeah, it's kind of, your efforts kind of pale in comparison to, you know.
But I love that thing you said about like in America or in the West or in a successful environment, you feel like you don't have a need. And so there's no sort of like impetus to reach out and grab the lifeline. Or there's less of one. So yeah, we've sort of lulled ourselves into not needing God, but we still do.
Yeah, and it's not like, also, you know, pursuing faith is not like because that was another thing. It's almost like it makes, you know, I think that's one of the things that I thought was that, you know, to be a Christian or to be religious was like less work, because it's like easier to kind of be like, oh well,
because it's a crutch.
Yeah, it's like, oh well, you know, God's taking care of that. Yeah. But in reality, I think that to be, you know, or at least for me, I don't know about everybody else, but for me, it's like, it's active. Like I have to constantly, you know, look into the Bible, read, learn, you know, interpret, you know, especially like try to also understand, like, you know, the passage that I'm reading right now, is there significance to that in my moment that I'm going through?
Was it just for the people at the time? But what's my takeaway?
Yeah, like, is this, you know, is how could I apply this to a relationship that I have? Yeah. And so it's way more active than,
it's not a lazy man's thing.
Yeah, it's just like, now I think to myself, it's like being an atheist is like, even though it was active, like I was telling you, it's active, but it's actively kind of rebelling against your, like, you have to be active, and you almost have to fight people on what they're saying, because you're like, because you're trying to reaffirm in your own head that it's true.
Rationalize it.
Yeah, you constantly need to rationalize this this thing. So,
so what are you studying right now? Like, are you reading a book? Are you in a particular like Bible study or church that's going through something? Or are you just in your own? Yeah. What are you doing?
I think I was reading Isaiah.
Okay.
Yeah, like I went back to the New Testament and I was reading this, and
you went back to Isaiah in the Old Testament.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's in the Old Testament, right? Yeah. So I was reading that, and I'm just like jumping around. I jump around a lot.
But you're still kind of on your own, like you don't have like a men's group or a Bible study or anything?
No, I mean, I like the church's story.
Yeah.
But it's just like, I don't know, I haven't gone out there again.
Yeah. Well, if Eric Huffman is listening, come get your wayward sheep. He's well, that's a great church. but there's lots of great churches. So, okay, well, that's very cool. I mean, I'm mostly just curious how someone that has had, I mean, it sounds like you've had a complete like gestalt shift. Your paradigm has shifted. And I'm always curious how that looks in, work and life and relationships. And anyway, so I appreciate you sharing all that.
Oh, no problem. I mean, yeah, it's important to think about this.
Yeah.
At a certain point in
Essential.
your life. Yeah.
Okay, so if people wanted to come and like pick your brain about some of the philosophical things that you think about, or maybe if they want to come to, I don't know if there's gonna be any like gallery showings at your, the art space, how can people find you? How can people connect if they want to?
Well, they can go to Forgin. It
sounds like 4chan every time you say it.
4chan?
Sorry.
Yeah.
It is not that.
Forgin. It's like forge and generative.
Not
merge.
like the number 4, but like forging your path.
Yeah, it's like forging, but it's spelled differently. It's FORGN.
Okay.
.art.
.art.
Yeah.
Forge and .art.
Yeah, that's right. Forge and .art. And they can go over there and see. So we have a series of workshops with sculpture and digital art and video editing. And so it's essentially a school for people to do that, plus a gallery, plus we do free workshops. The Web3 meetup is going to meet up over there as well. And like I said, we're fiscally sponsored by Fresh Arts, so we, it's also a charitable organization that we, for donations to go towards artists to work on these projects as well.
Man, that's very cool. I can see why Christine suggested we talk.
Yeah.
Is there anything else you wish you'd been able to say before we kind of close out, or I don't know, like something that you found interesting or encouraging along your own path you wish people knew?
Well, I mean, I was going to ask you about this organization. You guys do the podcast, and then you meet around here as well, or this is in Midtown. Is this your main studio?
Well, the studio is here at First Lutheran in Midtown, but our organization is made of. Our leadership team is lots of different ministry leaders from lots of different denominations. So the secret sauce of Theology by the Pint is that, other than we drink, and that's really fun, is that we get to hear a lot of different perspectives and views on whatever it is we're talking about. So we do live events, big live events once a month, follow-up events, and then, of course, the podcast. But at our live events, we'll pick a topic. So say, in October, we're doing a couple on faith and politics. It's like, how does your faith inform the way that you vote, if you vote? In November, now I know this may be coming out after these things are done, but in November we're going to be talking about gender and identity. Like, do you curate your own identity, or do you discover it? Is it a thing that exists that you have to sort of discover, or can you kind of make your own? Because we live in an age where you can curate your image on social media and the way that people perceive you. You really can. Like, you can make people think that you are XYZ person, but that's different from your identity. So that'll be interesting. We talk about kind of hot topics around like culture wars and biblical things like tough passages of scripture, or how do you even know you can trust the Bible? So we're kind of all over the place, but it's a space for people that are already Christians and even like theology nerds that want to dig in, but it's also a space for people that have not really been religious, or have kind of walked away from church because they were either wounded by church or just kind of over it, or like you said earlier, kind of in name only, like cultural Christians. Yeah. To kind of come back and maybe have that reignited, So that's kind of who we are. So if you're listening and you haven't come to any of our stuff, you should come, and you should come. They're a lot of fun. Cool. And, we have a sense of humor about the areas where we disagree, but you get to hear in real time people disagreeing about something and then sharing a beer and understanding that we can disagree about non-essential things, but we all agree we want people to know Jesus.
Yeah, that's interesting. That group of people who basically feel like they've been hurt by because I meet a bunch of people who are previously Christians too. Yep. And then I'm sitting there, vast majority of my life being an atheist, discussing it with them and saying, okay, well, what about? So I'm like on the other side, and they're
like, we've been on the team a while. There's some bad stuff too, or something. Yeah. And,
well, yeah, it's interesting. It's like, I kind of feel like that's really necessary and essential, is that people should get together and not necessarily, like pass judgment on people's what they feel or whatever, but have a conversation.
Yeah.
Because I think a lot of people, they intuitively are like, they are good people, and even if they're not aligned at that moment, they still have like a philosophical basis for what they're saying, and it's just like having a conversation. I think that's really good that you guys are doing that, and then having the conversation with people.
I think it is too. It's a great space to process that kind of stuff. Yeah.
I think people need to talk more and not get into their silos and not communicate.
Yeah.
Because I think that's also degrading the conversation.
Yeah.
And then people feel like they can't say anything. They feel like there's repercussions for saying things. And I think a lot of the time, potentially it's not from lack of understanding. Like, they do have an understanding that there are some ramifications for just doing things. So I think there's not necessarily a complete, it's not completely unjustified to, sorry, I'm like getting real esoteric. It's like people feel nervous, and they feel nervous maybe because there is something that they need to be, not necessarily be afraid of, but like be cautious about.
Yeah. Or do some business with God. I mean, I think people there's a dizzying number of people, especially like millennials and Gen Zs, that are walking away from faith and walking away from the church. Those two things are not always the same. But I think sometimes it's because the church is actually calling them to believe truth, and they're not ready to yet, right? But I think also the church has messed up in a lot of ways and has caused a lot of, I mean, when I say the church, I mean the people in the church there's been pain caused by the church. And but I think some people haven't actually experienced that, but they've heard so much about other people experiencing it that they have that like fear. It's almost like, having a fear of dogs because you had friends that were like bitten by a dog when they're little.
Yeah.
Because you never were.
Yeah.
But so then there's just the kind of the ethos around us is like, oh, church is judgy and bad and hypocritical. It's like, well, actually, there are some pretty decent churches, and church is not the same as the truth of Jesus and, God being the creator of the world.
And I didn't get into Christianity through the church.
Yeah.
I got into Christianity picking up the Bible and reading it. And
which is really cool. I like that story.
Well, it's just like, I don't know if it's like inherent apprehension with institutions, like institutions that as opposed to reading and then having a spiritual relationship. Yeah. I don't think it's bad. I think it actually is good to have, institutions where you can get together with them and communicate. We crave that. And during COVID, like that was it was like glaring. It's like not having interactions with other people
is hurting people.
Is bad. Yeah. And so I think that there's definitely a place for that,
Yeah. Agreed.
But yeah.
Well, you should come and you should enjoy and spar, and maybe even one of these days we'll get you up on a panel. People get to text their questions into a panel and hear them disagree. It's a lot of fun.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
This has been fun. If you're listening and you want to come to some of these conversations, go to theologybythepint.org. Check them out. Go check out forgen.art. I got it right.
Forgen.art.
Okay.
That's awesome.
And until we see you next time, we encourage you, as always, to question freely, think deeply, and disagree as needed.